Oh,
So I want to welcome everyone to our first Irene Casteel.
it doesn't need it. Oh, ew. What's the image over there? Not that image, that one.
I'd like to welcome you to the inaugural Irene Casteel.
Ew.
The Irene Casteel created public event to bring to Ohio University experts in the field of education, professional studies, and social sciences. So I thought it should be developed in practice society for the next 5 to 10 years. That should be discussed more about this year. The intent is to go beyond the traditional speakers that address current trends.
Yeah, I flipped the previewer and it became normal. Okay.
Culture and professional.
As long as it stays normal. As long as that one stays normal. This one can be flipped. It shouldn't matter because that one's more. Yes, but the preview on that camera's correct. I think the live stream is what's flipping it.
I'd like to recognize who is our director for student interactions. And I'd like to recognize Chris Howard, who is the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. So I'd like to give them a nice round. It's important to thank all the community organizations that make planning possible. First, I'd like to thank Irene Casteel and her state generosity for creating this Endowed position at Ohio Order and thus the Endowed Speaker Series. Casteel graduated from Ohio University in 1945, in Ohio. Casteel was a great joy teaching his teaching career at Casteel High School after the death of
He said he did it from and it's really
both the Irene Casteel Endowed Chair in Education, Professional Social Sciences, and the Irene Casteel Endowed Speaker Series with the General Class Lab University. This book of the series lives up to her amazing legacy that Irene Casteel founded at Ohio University and a celebration of her story. I also need to thank the committee of the Cultural and Special Events for their support for bringing the Irene Casteel Endowed Series from the abstract thoughts that merely existed on paper last year to a real-world event that all of us are doing tonight. In addition to the School of Social Sciences and Interaction, especially Dr. Crispis and Pam Penwell, for the financial logistical support to make tonight possible, my colleagues Craig Phipps and Ryan Lutz from the Writing Multimedia Studies program for being an amazing group of academics and support for the tireless work to make tonight happen. Finally, I'd like to thank the psychology program, especially for Keynote, for the Soul Labs, and Megan, Ryan Lutz for being one of the close to them, Dr. Rachel and Sarah. But sure love the discipline and enjoy working with students. I cannot think of better speaker to go to the series than Dr. Rachel. A research director take this and a prime example of a richer lieutenant. Her 2014 dissertation research from the University of York in England dealt with two interesting theoretical threads: the cultural stereotypes of online gamers and the relationship between social competence in quotation marks and online video game involvement. Her postdoctoral work under the Professor Dr. Thorsten Quantz of the University of Munster in Germany examines interpersonal and interpersonal social impacts of online video game involvement over a period. Her current work takes this, a mental health nonprofit organization that serves the gaming industry and gaming communities, has led her to help destigmatize mental health challenges and provide mental health information and support. Tonight's lecture, You Are Not Prepared, Moderating Metaverse, is a perfect topic that encapsulates the core charge of this series. Tonight's focus on future culture, especially the realms of virtual reality, will be a total society in the near future, and must be considered the ramifications of what surprises us like rapid influence of artificial intelligence that has covered essentially the past year. VR, AR, and all other modifications of reality that technology has brought in the last few years report our shared daily experiences. It's important to consider the impact now. With that, it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. Rachel.
For having me, thank you to Dr. Sarah Hayes, my lovely friend, for tech support.
We pressed record.
Right.
This image is flipped. I have no idea why. It's flipped. This is the. It will show. Right, it's gonna be that way, and that's fine. Okay.
So the first one I had was like Metaverse, and then my second thought was now I have so that's what we're here. Now, despite this title, I'm not actually going to talk about specific moderation tactics in Metaverse, which may be what you're expecting in the title, but what I'm going to talk about are the current strategies we have and our current Metaverse-like spaces today, and how that can inform how prepared, or mostly unprepared, we are for moderating. Jay gave me a lovely introduction, but this is always part of the slide package, so this is me, as you mentioned, I'm the researcher who takes this. I'm a passionate mental health advocate, Twitter boxer, and totally right now, and proponent of games as tools for mental wellness. I also have a YouTube channel where I talk about science of games, it's my scientific outreach, so if you are a YouTube person. And if you're not familiar with Take This, we are the oldest mental health nonprofit in the gaming space. We have an interesting position in that we serve gaming communities and the gaming industry. And we aim to teach challenges, and obviously moderation, lack of moderation, these areas. Unless there's no PA, I would not be a good psychologist if I did not prepare people for what we are not prepared for. So the presentation today will discuss discussions about sexual assault, suicidal ideation, extremism, terrorism, and violence. None of these discussions are particularly in-depth. If you don't want to engage with, please feel free. Here we are, in the future. I feel like I have to talk about the Metaverse because every time I talk to anyone about my work, the Metaverse is like the second. And to be honest, I hadn't given the Metaverse much thought until about 2 years ago when that started to happen. Like the best quotes I was getting in the newspapers, and like the newspapers were all about the Metaverse, even though it was time. So I like really leaned into it to the point where I'm like literally the face of the Metaverse campaign, which is so baffling to me. But I was like, all right, I'm leaving it. We're having these discussions. We're talking about it. So we're going to talk about it today. And specifically how we're going to move forward in these spaces so they don't leave us in the trash fire that we currently have in any social space. Yeah. So this is the side. We're going to talk about what is Metaverse. Honestly, I feel like I can talk for an hour. Just questions that I want. Is the Metaverse safe? Does a safe Metaverse matter? Who is it impacting? How is it impacting? Does it matter? If we decide it does matter, do we want to solve this problem? What are the research challenges in solving any questions you might have in the Metaverse? And then lastly, what do we do with all this information that I'm now talking about? So, like any good academic research, in this case, it's interesting because the concept of the Metaverse is everyone has to be learning. Everyone has to be learning. In 2022, I was asked to be part of the Metaverse Forum, where it was like a think tank with people from the industry, people from academia, and they said, okay, let's talk about the Metaverse. And the first question was like, define it. And we'll see, the definition is really wild. So here's one, really broad. The Metaverse is a shared, persistent, real-time, social online space for the economy. It's immersive, it's connected, it's not one world, but it's a whole collection. Some of the definitions. The Metaverse is a comprehensive, transcending state of gaming, where gamers can play the game outside of silos that they don't understand the computer. For this person, the Metaverse is really just about playing. So there's this one. The Metaverse in its fully realized state is an improbable mesh of permanent and permissionless worlds to which users can move. Still not. And then this is why, dare I say, you are living in the Metaverse. But is that, what is it, right? As much as I want to believe that the Metaverse is the silver surfer right into the Emerald City, which is what I thought when I Googled image search Metaverse, this is not what I think it is. This is what I thought it was in the early 90s, right? This is not necessarily. So I'm open with a little mental exercise for you to think about how you would define the Metaverse. We're going to play a little game for you to kind of get to your own definition. This or that Metaverse. So I'm going to give you a couple options in a couple seconds to think about where you land when it comes to these different characteristics that define what a Metaverse is. So first up, this or that, is the Metaverse one thing or is it a lot of things? Is it the Metaverse or is it multiple Metaverses?
I don't.
This or that, what's the function of the metaverse? Is it primarily for fun and game and fun? Or is it more multi-purpose?
I mean, we can pull stills out of a video. I think the whole point
This
is
or
that,
that,
look,
how
they
does it
said
exist? Is it
somewhere the person
persistent?
texted
Is it
Shane and she
changing
was
on
like,
days, right? Or is it more situational?
that shoe isn't enough frame in this.
Does it have high visual and behavioral fidelity? So by that I mean,
Yeah,
is
I
it
get
fully immersive
Yeah,
space where if I
would
look
be
at
worth
my
it.
arms
Do you want
here,
the good camera or do you want
I
your
move my head physically.
Because I have the
Visual
I have
or
the
my
5D. Well, I have the 5D. Which one would you rather have? The 5D. I am more comfortable working with mine. Okay, then go get yours.
And lastly, is metaverse the future?
This
I
I'll
know.
follow. Just yeah. I'll sit over here and just watch it.
So if I had to pick my team, right, this is the team I would pick. Many places, multi-purpose, persistent, I don't believe we are. Now, of course, your team is different, and that's okay, because we're all still trying to figure it out. But in order to have this conversation for the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to build from this, my definition, and create kind of a comprehensive idea of how we would define the metaverse, which would be this a persistent virtual world that exists, even though you're not actively engaged in it. It's a space where you can engage in the same daily activities, you would in another space, purpose, shopping, work, play.
What's the issue? Someone texted you and it popped up on your Mac saying that they want like formal pictures because this isn't really zoomed in on
So
her.
we think about these
Zoomed in
components
fit.
here, consistent, you engage in daily activities. I think maybe we can all think of the space that exists now that may fit this definition, because for me, this reminds me very much of a whole host of gaming spaces that exist now. And I would say that gaming spaces are the closest thing we have to metaverse, or I would say metaverse-like space. Places like
This camera's
and this is like World of Warcraft, which is, if you got the reference in the opening slide, we should be proud of it, but also, World of Warcraft is arguably the first experience I had in a metaverse space. It's an environment, engage in activities, shop, craft, you can earn a living, like gold farming was a thing, before we were in farmers and gold.
So do you want me to
And
just
while
go
this
back
was
to
absolutely the first time I was deeply involved in what I call metaverse space, my actual first metaverse experience probably goes to second time, which many people out there have heard of. It is still a thing, which I just learned. It came out in 2003, and they described it as an online multimedia platform that allows people to create an avatar and interact with other users, user-created content, and then multiplayer online. Now, in 2003, this is my internet. Possible to interact in, but this would mean that we were interacting with metaverse-like spaces, at least since 2000. Persistent online digital spaces, digital versions of ourselves, created. Now, with that said, with each passing day, we are moving forward into a more ideal, a more persistent, more fully immersive, more virtual reality experience, whole Ready Player One situation. And when we get there, when this type of metaverse becomes present, what are we doing to curate these spaces into spaces we want to be in? Tell me, Shane. Tell me the answer. Tell me.
Other side. Other side.
Shane.
Other side.
Shane.
Other side.
Shane. Other
The
side.
other side is sharp, but maybe not.
We have a little technical work as we are getting the microphones up and running.
There we are. Yay! Thank you very much. So when we get here, when we get to the Ready Player One situation, what are we doing to curate these spaces to be spaces that we actually want to spend time in? Because as I said before, gaming spaces are the closest thing we have to metaverse-like spaces, and if we think about the time that we spend in digital gaming spaces, if we all, most of us agree that the days look like this. There's ineffectiveness and moderation. There's a normalization of hate and harassment. There's a rise of extremist behaviors, all of which we're going to talk about today, in between the fun of creating and playing and doing what we do in everyday lives. So this is what I want to talk about today. How can we address this better so we can stop barreling towards this, which is just the same, just more immersive. I mean, I don't want that. I don't think anybody really wants that. So how are we going to avoid it? So we established we have metaverse-like spaces of today. So let's look at those. Are those safe? Are those spaces safe? And I know that we already determined that metaverse-like spaces are multifunctional, but for the rest of the discussion, I'm going to largely focus on one corner of it, which are games specifically for a few reasons. One, is the part of the metaverse I'm most invested in not being a dumpster fire. And two, because as I mentioned before, I do think games fit the most closely the definition of the metaverse as I mentioned earlier. So they're a great case study to move forward and think about what do we have, what's our situation now, how do we fix it? If we don't fix it now, what chance do we have when we start moving towards spaces that have higher visual and behavioral fidelity or Ready Player One situations? So first we're going to talk about if it's safe. We have to kind of scope out the problem. And this is one of my favorite quotes from the book, The Toxic Mediocrity of Video Game Culture and Why Gaming Culture is the Worst, by Chris Paul. It's a great book. And his quote is, although the world is full of jerks and the internet is full of jerks, one can certainly make a strong argument that some of the dirtiest are floating around video games, circulating around video games. A few paragraphs later, he continues, the common discourse and actions that have become normal, routine, and part of the video game environment, or the environment around video games, is troubling. And if you look at the research, it really, really is. This is looking at some of my own work, looking at the prevalence of what I call dark participation in gaming spaces. And here we found disruptive behavior of all kinds. Blue is directly targeted, directly experienced. Orange is witnessed. It's trash talking, verbal spamming, griefing. They're all more the norm than the exception. They're normalized. We also see it with more extreme forms, sexual harassment, hate speech, and violent threats. Again, experienced is in blue, and in orange is witnessed. In many cases, they are the norm and not the exception. Here's some new data from a project I'm doing actually right now, looking at dark participation in extremism, and we asked, do you think toxic behavior has become a culturally justified and normalized experience in games? 80% said yes. We asked the same question specifically in regards to hateful behavior, and 70% said yes. They are culturally justified, they are normalized, they are embedded in this space, we're just kind of accepting it, as that's the way it is, and that's what we're experiencing. So, are these spaces safe? No, I would say they're not. Although it is important to note that this work is referring to things that are primarily happening verbally, right? What happens when the opportunity to verbally be sexually harassing turns into the opportunity for something like sexual assault? Well, I did mention the future is now. We do already see this happening in metaverse-like spaces of today within the parameters that we have within the technology. This is a news article from 2018, and it talks about how a mom was horrified to see her daughter's avatar being assaulted within Roblox. In the article, there's a quote that said her child's avatar, the icon that represents here a multiplayer online gaming platform, who has blonde hair and wears a t-shirt, jeans, shorts, was being graphically assaulted by two male avatars on the playground of the game. And the child was 7, right? So this is absolutely awful. This is what we have in our metaverse-like spaces of today. Now what happens when they're more immersive? When they have higher fidelity. Again, we know exactly what this is going to look like because the future is now. This is a piece from 2022 discussing how the avatar of a 21-year-old researcher was sexually assaulted in Meta's virtual reality platform Horizon Worlds. In the article, there's a really interesting quote about the incident. It says, quote, "It still counts. It has a real impact on users." And I think that's a really important point to keep in mind, is that the actions in these digital spaces, whether it's in Roblox, whether it's in something more immersive, they have real psychological repercussions. And there tends to be this idea that there's a delineation between digital experiences and physical experiences. And while there are, the psychological and physiological repercussions of being assaulted in a digital space is very real. It's very real. And it's something we've known for nearly 2 decades. This is a paper from 2006. Their participants rate their level of comfort in response to animate and inanimate objects in live and virtual viewing conditions, and they measured their electrodermal activity. They observed significant negative reactions to violations of interpersonal space in what they called stereoscopic 3D displays, right? as like way beyond before what we know today, right? Them exposed to the natural environment. It was analogous, it was synonymous. They were experiencing the same physiological responses. So that transitions us to the next question. Why does a safe metaverse matter? What's the real impact of this? Who's being impacted and how are they being impacted? First, we're going to do the who, and then we're going to do how. So we've already shown that the direct target is likely to be affected. Psychological repercussions are very real, they're the same, but beyond the direct target, who's really being impacted? And there's a real gap in understanding the nature, severity, and kind of radius of these behaviors beyond the direct target. These behaviors, this toxicity, whatever you want to call it, it harms not only the person who's directly affected, but the broader community of witnesses. This is called the radius of impact. This comes from the Fair Play Alliance. You can see here, there's a lot of them. Player communities, content moderators, game developers, game companies, teachers, caregivers, friends, family. There's a long line of direct and indirect, I don't know what that one is, sorry. Direct and indirect repercussions. So this isn't just about person A doing something and person B or saying something to person B. It's about person A being a real person with feelings, right? And person B doing something awful to person A. And all these other people witnessing it. But it's not just like 4 people witnessing, it's like 4,000 people witnessing it because it's happening in an open public space. The community managers are also witnesses to it because that's who they go to. The community managers, and then they go to their friends and family. And then the community managers go to their therapists because I think they should all have one. And this is the radius, right? And this is a very conservative radius because each of these circles can then circle out for just a single incident. Now, before you say, Rachel, aren't you being a bitch man? No, I am nothing but a woman of science. And research has found both short and long-term mental health repercussions to online harassment for the direct target, as well as any third-party online person may witness it. So that's the who. Who's being impacted? Everyone. Direct target, onlookers, community managers, family, friends. What about the how? I'm going to focus on 2 hows today. How the normalization of hate and harassment, the ineffective moderation of the metaverse-like spaces of today impact us both individually and societally on these through these 2 lenses, both mental health and extremism and radicalization. So first, mental health. The mental health impact of our digital spaces does not just like magically contain itself in the 4 walls of our digital playgrounds. If someone says something horrible to me and I turn off and I walk away, I'm still affected by that interaction that happened. And research has found that these behaviors can and do have significant mental health impact, and I mean significant. This is from the 2021 ADL report that says, how has online harassment impacted your mental health? And 1 in 10 said they had suicidal thoughts because of their online harassment. I don't know what I'm doing to this microphone. They specifically asked, how have your experiences of disruptive behaviors in online games influenced your day-to-day? And there was a wide range. Felt uncomfortable was 1 in 4, felt less social was 1 in 5. Taking steps to reduce my personal safety was nearly 1 in 5. Contacted the police was 1 in 10. Had school and work negatively impacted was also 1 in 10. What's notable here is that these findings were both as a direct target, but also a witness. So there's this whole ripple effect that we need to keep in mind. So these outcomes, as you see here, have significant consequences, both in the gaming space, felt less social or felt uncomfortable, but also outside of it. We're seeing individual repercussions, but we're also seeing societal repercussions. So having work or school negatively impacted 1 in 10, there's 3 billion game players. Right? You think of that on the sheer scale of society, that becomes a societal problem. Now, touch on the ways in which these individual outcomes start to creep into societal impacts. This is a report from 2021 from the Surgeon General. It's a bit of a long quote, but I think it's important. It's on the opening page of the report. And it says, while technology platforms have improved our lives in important ways, we know for many people they can also have adverse effects. When not deployed responsibly and safely, these tools can pit us against each other, reinforce negative behaviors like bullying and exclusion, and undermine the safe and supportive environments young people need and deserve. So again, the individual impact on mental health from toxic spaces is a societal problem. It's contributing to broader discussions of cyberbullying and exclusion, as discussed here, and a lack of what they call safe and supportive digital environments. And when we think about these impacts right now, we're talking about our current, again, metaverse-like spaces. Bullying and exclusion is awful. It can have significant mental health impacts, as we noted in the previous slides. But we also have to remember that this is just the tip of the iceberg, because there are a lot of really bad things that happen online in the metaverse-like spaces of today. What are they going to look like in the metaverse-like spaces of tomorrow? There's also more societal impacts to consider, and this is in the context of extremism and radicalization. So in the metaverse-like spaces of today, it refers to the leveraging of the toxic cultures for attitude and behavior change, specifically in the context of extremism and radicalization. And you may be thinking that escalated quickly. And you're right, except not that quickly, because as I mentioned before, and I showed the data, toxicity has been embedded in gaming cultures for a significant amount of time. And this has been tied specifically and linked specifically to extremism and radicalization. So research has pointed out that participation in toxic, hateful behaviors is associated with an increased risk in being persuaded by far-right extremist propaganda specifically. So TLDR, being entrenched in a culture that normalizes hate increases the likelihood that you too may choose to participate in this behavior. Because when we allow hate to spread without consequence, it normalizes in all spaces. And clearly our moderation is failing us somewhere along the line because this has become normalized, as we already discussed. Now, what this research is pointing out specifically was that participation to toxic gamer behavior can leave you more vulnerable to more extreme forms of behavior, both in and out of game. And we know from years of psychological research that we are who our friends are, right? So like your mom's like, don't hang out with the kids smoking behind the gym, right? Because she doesn't want that peer group to influence the way you see and interact with the world. And this is the same idea, just on a much larger scale within our digital spaces. We also know that many perpetrators of real-world violence are radicalized online first. So this is a big consequence, if you ask me. And if you remember those prevalence graphs earlier about the normalization of hate and toxicity, this also extends to more extreme behavior. So this is some of my recent work that came out of our work. It's a grant project funded by the Department of Homeland Security, looking specifically at extremism in games. And again, we see direct target and witness. Direct experiences are lower on the whole than we saw before, but witnessing these actions is still more the norm than the exception for most of these extreme categories: racism, misogyny, LGBTQIA hate, and white nationalism. Anti-government and Islamism still hold strong at about 1 in 4, 28 to 25%. So the sheer normalcy of these behaviors has led to the perception, and honestly the reality, that these spaces aren't welcoming, that they're places where hate is commonplace, hate harassment. Now, one of these big part of the normalization, specifically in the context of extremism, has to do with the cultures that have developed in these metaverse-like spaces. And specifically around this identity, I want to talk about of a gamer. Gamer is a social identity. A player is a temporary status that you have while you're functionally playing a game, but a gamer is how you identify yourself in the world. You know, you wear funny t-shirts, and it's the way you decorate your office. I know there's some gamers on here. It helps us identify ourselves in the world. I have a lot of social identities. I would say I'm a gamer, even though I have small children who don't play games very often. But these identities are important, as I said, because they position ourselves in the world. Now, the caveat here is when it comes to gamer cultures, because of the normalization of hate, they're more associated with exclusion than inclusion, which is why we have that phrase that we hear a lot called toxic gamer cultures. So over the last year, I was doing some work in collaboration with the University of Texas, with Bill Swan and Alexi Martel, looking at this idea called identity fusion. So typically we have our individual identities and we have our group identities, and these identities are separate, as you see in the first picture. But sometimes these identities fuse together and they become more porous, and this is called identity fusion. And fusion is interesting because when your identities fuse, you're more willing to self-sacrifice in service of both groups. And the best example I can give, my dad was a Marine. Once a Marine, always a Marine. There is no teasing apart any part that is the Marine and any part that is any other part of my father, right? Now, traditionally, fusion happens because you have a deep emotional bond with the group that happens over shared experiences, over a certain period of time. You have shared norms, you have a shared language, you're a close, tight-knit group. But these contributors, as I read over them, sounded a lot like gaming to me. Shared experiences, close, tight-knit groups. So we're like, okay, let's look at fusion among gamers, knowing that the cultures are embedded in this idea of hate. So what we found is that people with fused identity
also were more likely to score higher on measures of, it says willingness to fight or die, which is the fusion measure, that's how you determine if you're fused or not. But narcissism, Machiavellianism, which is a personality trait associated with being deceitful and lacking morality, narcissism, psychopathy, which is measured as a lack of empathy, racism, sexism, and it says alt-right identity, but it should say espousing the beliefs associated with white nationalism, because that's what the questions were about. Interestingly, it was not associated with age, gender, or how long they had played years gaming, but it was associated with gameplay time. And we also found the relationships to be significantly stronger among those who played multiplayer versus single player, to me suggesting that the relationships were stronger based on greater exposure to communities. So the longer you're immersed in the community, the greater likelihood you are to be exposed to extreme ideologies, the greater likelihood you are to adopt and endorse more extreme behaviors like racism and sexism and that sort of thing. So this is a cultural impact, right? We're getting to the swastika. This is a cultural impact. Having a fused identity is not doing that. Having a fused identity changes the way we see and interact with the world. And what makes us think this culture is going to change in any way by it just becoming more embedded and more complicated and more complex? We have to think how there will absolutely be new opportunities for leveraging these spaces. One big concern is like new ways to leverage it, right? So our moderation is largely focused on text-based moderation. We don't have a lot of efforts to do like moderation of objects that are created, or this is a Roblox map that's a World War II simulator. Like we don't have the tools already now to moderate this, and what's going to happen when it becomes more immersive. This kind of content exists because of failed moderation. So when we see this normalization combined with failed moderation, this has opened the door for leveraging these identities for recruitment, the dissemination of propaganda. For the future, there is a lot of talk and a genuine concern about using more immersive spaces as training grounds to perpetrate violence. And it's horrifying to think about. How are we going to know that these spaces are created in our metaverse-like spaces? How are we going to find them? How are we going to take them down? How are we going to stop them? How are we going to see them? How are we going to watch them? Brought you down, I know. I'm gonna bring you back up, I promise. In my notes I put, now that we're all sufficiently horrified, let's talk about research challenges. If we want to improve these spaces, we're going to have to research them. If we want to research the metaverse-like spaces of today and tomorrow, we have to think about the limitations. The first limitation is one that all the researchers in here can relate to: data collection. High quality data has been the greatest limitation of researchers in the field of psychology, in the field of game studies, and the most significant roadblock to understanding our metaverse-like spaces of today, particularly because we're trying to combat this moral panic kind of broad stroke thinking. It's really hard to get over like the wounds of the past and be like, we're just trying to make these spaces better. The work of researchers is very limited by our access to data. Lack of access to high quality data limits us in many ways. Our research design, right? We do snapshot like single, kind of cross-sectional studies, participant recruitment. If I get like 250 people, I'm like super happy. There's 3 billion gamers. Like that's not super great. It's hard to recruit them. It's usually like a social media situation. Having active industry collaborators, for instance, would solve a lot of these problems. And it's something that I often soapbox about. And then to which I hear, that's a you problem. We have access to all this stuff. And we don't really want to work with you because academics are annoying. We have terrible time management. I don't have any money. It's hard. Also, I have great time management. I'm just going to throw that out there. But the collaboration, right, subjectivity, there is really value in working together with industry partners and people in academia. But we're going to have to, start to work together. But there have been really novel kind of movements to get past this data collection without working together. The Oxford Internet Institute, for example, has a collaboration with the ESA. They've got some access. We can also get creative, like Roblox, for instance, has an open API. They can make a lot, you can scrape it, and I've done that in the past. I also did this work last year with, in collaboration with a bunch of partners, but one of them was Gamer Safer. And Gamer Safer is like an age verification and moderation third-party platform that people can put on their private Minecraft servers. So they connected us with people who host private servers, and we got data that way. So there are some novel ways to kind of get around the data problem. But honestly, I think if we're gonna do anything at scale, there's gonna have to be collaboration with tech. Now, the second consideration, shout out to Portal. We went to dinner with some students, and one of them said Portal was their favorite, so here you go. It's very inspiring. Engaging in ineffectively moderated spaces is a risk to the user and a risk to the researcher who's researching this space. I was recently part of a Vox poll panel about researcher safety, and the concerns in the metaverse was actually the topic of the panel. And it was a topic that I'd never formally really considered before, and definitely not one that I've talked about in kind of a public advocacy way, but it's one I wanted to bring up here because engaging in any kind of research, any kind of metaverse-like space, I was certainly given no counsel about what it was going to encounter, what I needed to do to protect myself, what my resources were. And we have these spaces today, we're going to have these spaces tomorrow, and it is irresponsible to send people into these spaces ill-prepared. So this is the Vox poll output that was kind of the central of the panel. Dr. Elizabeth Pearson was one of the authors on it. Now, in this, they were talking specifically about researchers in the extremist space, but there are a lot of lessons here that can and should be generalized as a whole within any kind of metaverse-like space. Any space where you may encounter hate, harassment, that sort of stuff, especially in a normalized situation. So what are the risks here that we need to think about, and what should we be doing about it? The first thing that researchers they interviewed expressed was explicit concern about the fact they had no idea of the risks they were getting into before they started doing it. Research in metaverse-like spaces today and tomorrow need proper safeguarding for researchers, including information on the real harms they could experience directly, the real harms they could witness, understanding that these effects aren't just online, they're not magically contained, they will impact you in all areas of your life. And this report, 1 in 4, 26%, said they wanted explicitly written guidance on what to expect in terms of potential harms and the current support, if there's any available. They also noted this doesn't exist, nobody had ever seen any kind of written guidance given to them. As I said, I certainly wasn't born. I was grateful that I was more seasoned scholars than me gave me some guidance and some direction when I entered the space, but it was certainly not some kind of comprehensive informed consent. Now, the harms they talked about were threefold: external, internal, and professional. External harms are kind of like what you would expect in a space where there's harassment and threats of physical harm, gender and identity-based harm, and online harassment, generally. As researchers, we're entering these spaces and we're poking around, even with the best of intentions to make the world a better place. These are real risks of harm. I just read an awful Twitter thread this morning, actually, about someone who's being chronically swatted, chronically, and there's little to do about it. Internal harms are kind of the repercussions of the external harms: isolation and withdrawal, emotional issues that can develop over time, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder symptomology is a long-term debilitating repercussion to experience. And then combined, they led to professional harms, which were identified as the report being caused by the other two. So as an effect of online harassment, it silences the researchers, it can have a negative impact on career progression, the desire to avoid public abuse. They don't do talks like this. They don't want to publish their work with their full name. They don't want to do interviews because they don't want more of this. And it leads to a lack of visibility and typically impacts the lowest in power, the PhD students, the early career researchers. So I think one of the big takeaways from here, again, is to remember that online and offline is a false dichotomy, and when we experience in these spaces are very real and they impact every aspect of our lives. And when we study or when we research these spaces, it doesn't happen in a vacuum apart from our professional and personal lives. The second thing was boundary setting. Boundary setting is difficult, especially when it comes to metaverse-like spaces if we're talking about them as games, because most of us in this field went into this field because we have a love for interacting with them. So what's working, what isn't? As much as I like to think playing The Witcher 3's work. Maybe, kind of. Boundary setting is difficult to navigate even in the best of times, especially for early career researchers, and it's about setting boundaries in the physical space, prepare them Do you have a separate room that you go to? This was a big issue in COVID times. I feel like it really actually brought up this point. Like your desk shouldn't be next to your bed. It should be somewhere else. Like you have to have these physical boundaries. It's about digital boundaries as well, though. How do you protect your personal identity? How do you make sure you're not giving away personal information? How do you scrape your information from the internet so people can't find you? These sorts of things. It's technical boundaries, but also physical boundaries. And also mental boundaries. One suggestion was setting timers. Like especially for the extremism and terrorism stuff, if you're looking at really kind of awful content, set a timer so you're not being able to fall down the rabbit hole and get stuck into forever. Both of these points tie into the need for a great need for institutionalized support, including responding to harms when they happen. A lot of people said they would go to their institution and say harm has occurred, and they'd be like, I don't know what to do with you because it's online and it's not the same, and we don't have the protocols, and we don't know what to do. 31% in this report said they wanted a formalized network of how to get support from their institution, but they also wanted informal networks of support, which is what I found in my work, informal networks like WhatsApp groups and that sort of thing. The report also noted that, quote, institutions frequently fail to regard online spaces as a valid research location needing research protection. Just not true. So as I hope I have demonstrated here, online harms are offline harms, online harms are real and important and vital, and we need formalized support for the people who are studying these spaces up to date and support. So this is what the problems are. We know we have to fix them. We have to address them. We have to start expanding on them before we get to Ready Player One. So what do we do? Do we burn it? We're doomed to failure. I like to be not. I like to be a bit more hopeful. So I'm going to end today with some tangible ideas. Just spitball in here. See what sticks. About how to just improve our present. Because if we can improve our present, we're in a better position to improve our future. Advice number one is changing the environment. Changing the environment of the metaverse-like spaces we have today. Better moderation. Even if we didn't improve a single moderation tool, can we at least like be transparent about what we're actually doing in there? Nobody even really tells you what they're doing. Xbox released its first transparency report ever this year, which is a great step. But like they're the only ones who've done it. And also it's not like super clear. I mean, it's better than nothing, but it's not like the best transparency report I've ever seen. To understand, you know, what's happening, what's being reported, what's being actioned, what strategies are you using that are proactive instead of reactive? How can we learn from it? How can we all do it? So we're all on the same page. We all need to be on the same page. I also talk about community management, which I think is a really important, it's an interesting thing. You know, they shape the community. A lot of people think of community management as people just like ban the trolls. But like if we're just playing whack-a-mole, like you're never going to win that game. So I'd like to have more discussions about the role of community management, how they're shaping the norms, how they're a pivotal part of actually this culture change if we want to actually shift the culture that's happening in these spaces. In the work I mentioned earlier that we did on Minecraft, we actually found that community management strategies, the rules that they set and the amount of moderators they had to kind of enforce the rules was a much greater predictor of how toxic the environment was as compared to just bans. So it really is about kind of shaping the community and what's expected and what's normalized versus just like whack-a-moling the bad guys. And then lastly, institutionalized support, as I mentioned, about changing the research environment. We need institutionalized support. We are failing students if we are not doing this for them. We truly are. The second is advocacy and outreach. One aspect is parental education. Again, with moderation and CMs, like we can try and fix the problems of tomorrow, but how will we fix the problems of today? And I cannot understate the amount of conversations I have where it's like, I know my son's on Discord. Cool. With who? Okay. How many people are there? Right? We have to have some kind of education that gets passed down to the future generation. And more proactive advocacy about what's acceptable, what's not, who are they talking with, what are they doing, what do they do when they encounter swastikas in their Roblox map? Do they even know what to do? Do they even know if that's normalized or if that's an acceptable part of culture? Or do they know it's not? Do parents even know they're encountering it? Yeah. And you think about cyberbullying, which I think is a good analogy because I think it took a long time actually for parents to get on board to understand the severity of cyberbullying. And like we have to make that whole jump again to think about the more broader effects and experiences and repercussions that are happening. in these spaces. Also, again, education, advocacy, outreach on behalf of the researchers. We need to advocate for them. And then, data access and transparency. Data, at least for me, is always a problem. Self-regulation and self-policing may not work in a place where there's a direct conflict of interest, so it makes sense that the industry may not want to jump on board with research that's going to publicly be like, here's some problems. But we've got to start working together. We just have to. I mentioned earlier that with Minecraft, we found a whole lot of stuff there about CMs and about moderation strategies, and what was really great about that is that we just released it into the world, right? And everyone could have it. From indies to AAAs, everybody had the same information. So even if you don't want to work with us, I think the industry should, just some transparency about what they're doing and their strategies. I digress. If we keep where we are, just gonna have the same results that we have now. Spaces that can be fun, the spaces where there's a lot of problems, spaces that are causing problems, individual and societal problems on a large scale. And I know there's always gonna be bad actors on the internet. In our metaverse spaces like of today, in our metaverse spaces of tomorrow, severe negative mental health repercussions are happening to the targets, to the witnesses. We're trying to make these spaces better, but we're also at risk of being targets and witnesses to lots of awful things. But I think if we all band together, here's our kumbaya moment, if we all band together, I do think there is hope to change the culture and change the shift before full Ready Player One becomes more ubiquitous and more affordable and more everywhere, more magnified. So, hopeful, didn't feel as hopeful as I thought it would. I promise it is hopeful. But thank you for having me, and I do have some time for questions if you have any.
So we do have about 10 minutes for any questions, and I will go ahead and pass the mic back in.
Hi, I just had a question. You talked a little bit about parent education. I have a brother who's 11 and my parents have no idea what to do with him. So I didn't know if you had any recommendations of things I could tell him about now because he's just starting to really enter these spaces.
Yeah, great question. I have my oldest is 8, so it's not quite 11. Definitely a strategy. One, just talk to them super casually, what are you playing? Who are you with? What do you like about it? What are you doing in there? And see if anything seems off about what they're saying. Especially 11, I would still have a pretty good touch point about who he's actually engaging with. Stranger danger is a thing in digital spaces. And I would start with it. It's about having an open dialogue and about having an eye on what's actually happening and not letting them kind of run wild and the waterfall lesson on the internet because it is not moderated well. So we cannot trust the space to contain it and be safe.
Hi, how much do you think that within the last 2 decades primarily, the polarization of politics and different, modern civil, just focuses have impacted this gaming, the gaming spaces in terms of what people are saying and how people are saying it?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I think that our digital spaces are a reflection of culture, but they also create culture. So I think it's definitely a two-way street, but it has absolutely impacted my mental health for the last 2 decades. The polarization, right? And it's not impacted culture that way. So I would say it has impacted it, but it's also incubated it and spit it back. Yeah.
Sorry. Do you think that, where do you think that this started? Do you think it started with the lack of moderation in internet spaces as we had PCs and laptops, or do you think this is something that has more picked up now rather than then?
I think it's always been there. I think it is more visible now because more people are in these digital spaces now, and I think more people feel comfortable expressing more.
So I wanted to go off towards the end of your presentation, you're talking about the importance of education. And one of the things I thought about when you were talking about that idea is how do we get information out and educate people? Because one of my frustrations being an academic is that our information doesn't get out to the public, right? It's in our great journals, but they don't read our journals. And often the other side of that is that media pays attention to the sensationalized pieces, right? Because video games cause violence. No, they don't.
Don't get me started, Mark.
Right. But
We just had an hour-long
combining
discussion.
with that last question, there's also an increased distrust of media, which is one of the only outlets we have to educate the public.
Yeah, and also the media is not super interested in like the balanced, nuanced conversation. Yeah, it is something I've struggled with, and it's something I'm really passionate about. I started a YouTube channel a couple years ago for that exact reason. Because I thought, oh, this is great. Where are the parents? They're on the internet. Where are they? They're on YouTube. I'll make YouTube channel. It turns out it's great for game studies people. So it's parents still not so much interested in the design. I personally think the largest scale public service campaign government funded is the only way to get like small tidbits on a mass scale. Games for Change, your really cool partnership with Nickelodeon, Teen Titans, Cartoon Network, Cartoon Network. They did a cute little kids day and had a little printout and those kinds of things. You have to get parents where they are and they also wrote a book for parents. Before I was a parent. They don't have time to read that book. They don't have time. So yeah, we have to meet them where they are, but it has to happen. They're not going to be there.
So I think we have time for one more question from the floor.
So what do you think the prevalence of social media as a whole and the kind of evidence that we've seen of racially motivated attacks and things like that that has been blown up and exacerbated by social media and in turn in gaming communities? How do you think that correlates?
Yeah, they're definitely related, and we see a lot of social media. But the thing about social media is they're 20 years ahead of games in terms of the moderation spectrum. And they're only like this way. Think about 20 years behind. So they're related.
So I guess I'll have the privilege of asking the last question then. So you've talked a lot about the negative components in terms of Roblox. You talked about it that you see sometimes in some of the other games. Let's talk about a more positive aspect, and let's talk about Animal Crossing, which is out there. I have a few minutes. I kind of essential. So if you're saying that there's negative components are what is leading to this polarization, what can we learn from games like Animal Crossing and others that are pro-social that don't have the negative elements that you were describing through the course of this presentation?
Let me say, games are overwhelmingly more positive than negative. Our Metaverse like people say are overwhelmingly more positive than negative. I'm glad it's making that noise for him. It wasn't me. He was giving me a look like it was my fault.
Oh,
I saw the whole time.
So.
It's a microphone. Games are overwhelmingly more positive than negative. The things I see, games promote social learning. Games can be great for bringing people together. I grew up in a small town in Texas. If there was any other girl who liked video games in my town, there was not. I wish I had the internet of today that I had back then. So social connection, reduction in loneliness, it's linked to increased creativity. They can be great spaces for stress relief and mood management. You know, you have a bad day, you log into Animal Crossing, you tend to your farm, it's relaxing, and you have a better mood. It moves your mood into something more positive. So games are actually really great tools, even the ones with the social components. It's just the bad is the loudest group. As always, the dissenters are the loudest. And they have shifted the culture of the space that's made it awful to be. Like, I would never, I don't want to say it, I'm on the stream. There are certain games we would never play because of their reputation for their social media, right? So we have to kind of move the positive into all the spaces and make that louder.
So with that being said, that is a great place for tonight. Let's once again, please give Rachel a round of applause. Now, I do have one more thank you to Dean Jan on Nathan from the School of Business, as he was able to give us the technical support to actually have the microphone so we could hear. So there will be a lovely reception outside, so thank you for coming, and have a good night.